Good afternoon and welcome to this presentation of Dual Allegiances in America, Consideration of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Perspectives on Civil and Religious Identities, which the Collegium Institute and its director, Dr. Daniel Cheely, are proud and pleased to sponsor. This event is also sponsored by a number of groups, PRUX, the Program for Research on Religion and the Urban Civil Society, the Jewish Study Program's Kuchin Seminar Series, the Department of Religious Studies, the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, the Penn Muslim Student Association, and the Penn Catholic Newman Community. I'm Peg Hogan, Dr. Margaret Hogan. I'm late of the University of Portland in Oregon, where I held their endowed chair of ethics and accepted an invitation from Dan Cheely to contribute to his work here at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm only the opening act, and so I don't want to have very much to say, except that this is the way the program will proceed. I will give a brief introduction of the speakers. If I were to give an adequate introduction of all of them, that's all we would have time for. So I've cut the introduction to very short of all of these wonderful guest speakers that we have today. So I'll give an introduction of each of them. Then Dr. Roger Smith will give the introduction to the theme. He will be followed by Dr. Beth Wenger, then Dr. Michael Breidenbach, and then Dr. Adan Sulfigar, and in that order. All of whom are professionals, and I know that they will respect the time allotments that are given to them, and I won't have to interrupt their presentation. So we look forward to that. One more housekeeping item. If you are here for CLE credits, the desk is right outside by the clock, and so you need to just sign up there, and also, as all CLE credits, pay for them. So, Dr. Roger Smith is the holder of the Christopher H. Brown Distinguished Professorship of Political Science. He was president of the American Political Science Association from 2018 to 2019. His research centers on constitutional law, American political thought, and modern legal and political theory, with special interest in questions of citizenship, race, ethnicity, and gender. He is the author of several books, including Political Personhood, The Role of Values, Interests, and Identities, out of the University of Chicago Press. Dr. Beth Wenger holds the Moritz and Josephine Berg Professorship of History. She is the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies in the School of Arts and Sciences. Her focus and research is on Jewish history. She was one of 4 founding historians who helped to create the core exhibition at the National Museum of American Jewish History here in Philadelphia. And she continues to serve as historical consultant to the museum. Her most recent book is a co-edit anthology entitled Gender in Judaism and Islam, Common Lives, Uncommon Heritage. Dr. Michael Breidenbach is the Assistant Professor of History at Ave Maria University in Florida. He is a research associate at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and a Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Ryan Center at Villanova University. Dr. Breidenbach's research interests concern the history of political, legal, and religious thought. He has particular interest in religious liberty, church and state, and the relationship between religion and politics. His current book, How Catholics Became American, is a history of religious liberty and church-state relations in early America and the Atlantic world. It is forthcoming from Harvard University Press, and it's a delightful read. Adan Sulfigar is Assistant Professor of Law at Rutgers University Law School. He is a legal historian working on Islamic law, criminal law, and law in the global South, with specific interest in legal obligation, jihad and revolution, policing, and criminal codes. He previously helped draft and implement criminal codes in Maldives and Somalia. He was selected as the Wallace Johnson Fellow by the American Society for Legal History to support his first book on collective duties in Islamic law. Dr. Smith.
Well, thank you, Peg. Thank you, Dan, and the Collegium, and all the sponsors of this event, and all of you for coming. My task is to provide a general overview of the historical relationship of American citizenship to those who claim dual allegiances, particularly allegiances to religious traditions, and particularly the three great Abrahamic religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Then my colleagues will speak about the perspectives of those particular traditions. Let me start by noting that most political communities historically have had an official religion. As a political scientist, I've argued that this is so for a political reason. Little, if anything, inspires political allegiance as much as a belief that it is a divine obligation. The United States was probably the first nation that did not have an established church. But that was not because doing so was altogether foreign to the American mind. It was because some of the new states, like New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, had established Congregationalist churches, while many others, including Virginia, New York, Maryland, and the Carolinas, had established the Anglican or Episcopalian Church, though Maryland had originally been a proprietary colony of the Catholic Lord Baltimore. Only the Baptists of Rhode Island and the Quakers of Pennsylvania adopted policies of religious freedom. This diversity among the newly independent states meant there could be no agreement on a Church of the United States. Instead, the 1787 Constitution banned religious tests for federal offices, and the First Amendment then banned federal laws respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Those disestablishment measures also reflected the fact that the religious fervor of the First Great Awakening in the early 18th century had died down by the time of the American Revolution, so that many leading revolutionaries came to favor greater separation of church and state, particularly in those colonies where the Anglican Church raised issues of competing allegiances to England. Jefferson and Madison led the effort to disestablish the Anglican Church in Virginia in the 1780s, with Madison arguing that believers had an allegiance to God that should not be subordinated to state religious mandates. Nonetheless, the American revolutionaries justified their cause partly in religious terms. Even the secular-minded Thomas Paine wrote in Common Sense that it appeared to be the plan of Providence for America to become independent, and that the new Americans could claim brotherhood with European Christians. For many, this meant Protestant Christians. One of the catalysts of the revolution was the Quebec Act of 1774, which offended Protestant colonists by granting religious freedom and equal status to Quebec's Catholics. Maryland had already reacted against its Catholic origins by banning Catholics from holding public offices, and Catholics were unpopular in most other areas. Like most nations until the last third of the 20th century, moreover, the United States was long wary of dual allegiances. From the first Naturalization Act in 1790 onward, applicants were required to take an oath, not only to support the Constitution, but also to, quote, absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to every foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty. Just as for John Locke, whose letter concerning religious toleration was widely read in the colonies, for Americans until well into the 20th century, it remained Catholics who were most suspected of holding dual allegiances inconsistent with American citizenship. Many revolutionaries actually identified with Jews, seeing themselves as God's new chosen people, a conception that contributed to Yale's inscribing its motto, Light and Truth, in Hebrew as well as in Latin on its coat of arms. Admittedly, however, this admiration for Jews was somewhat like the admiration Euro-descended Americans sometimes expressed for Native Americans. They had their virtues, but they still needed to assimilate if they were to be acceptable in the new republic. Throughout the first two-thirds of the 19th century, most Jews appear to have done so, sometimes ceasing to identify as Jewish. Muslims were rare in the new nation, but also not objects of any particular suspicion or hostility. When the U.S. settled disputes over the Barbary pirates via the Treaty of Tripoli in 1797, the Senate overwhelmingly approved, and President John Adams signed its Article 11, which states, quote, "As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Mussulmen, and as the said states never have entered into any war or act of hostility against any Mohammedan nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries, the U.S. and what is now Libya." Despite that sentiment, in those same years, Adams and his fellow Federalists were increasing the residency period for naturalization, fearing immigrants from monarchical countries, and especially from Catholic monarchical countries, as well as just anyone who might vote Jeffersonian. The Federalists and their naturalization policies lost out after the election of 1800, but from the 1830s through the 1850s, the influx of Irish and German Catholic immigrants in the face of the resurgent Protestantism, the Second Great Awakening, spurred the rise of American nativism, beginning with Samuel F.B. Morse's 1835 screed, "Imminent dangers to the free institutions of the United States." It portrayed Catholic immigrants, said to, quote, "obey their priests as demigods," as tools of a Jesuit conspiracy to subject America to Roman Catholic despotism. In a similar spirit, in May and July of 1844, here in Philadelphia, government militia assisted Protestant citizens as they rioted against Catholics who opposed using the Protestant Bible in the public schools. The Protestant rioters burned Catholic churches and killed and wounded hundreds. Nonetheless, these nativist campaigns and the later Know-Nothing parties of the 1850s failed to change national immigration, naturalization, and citizenship policies, apart from ultimately conceding the legitimacy of Catholic parochial schools. But after the Civil War, the Grant administration had no problem authorizing different Christian denominations to take over relations with particular tribes in order to convert them to Christianity and bury the Indian in the citizen, as the policy supporters said. The Supreme Court had no trouble overriding the polygamous beliefs and practices of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints as inconsistent both with American republicanism and civilized religions. Throughout the 19th century, most state and local governments actively aided and accommodated the dominant forms of Christianity and hindered minority religions without protest from American courts. With those precedents, it's not surprising that many native stock Protestant Americans of all classes reacted with renewed hostility to the heightened immigration of Southern and Eastern European Jews and Catholics in the late 19th and early 20th century. Calls for immigration restriction began in the 1890s and ultimately produced the primarily race-based national origins quota system from the 1920s through the 1960s. But the racial theories used to justify that system often portrayed the Jews and Catholics from these regions as constituting the lower and untrustworthy ranks of the white race. The revived Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s, based as much in Indiana as in the South, propagated hatred toward Jews and Catholics as much as toward African Americans. In the Northeast and other parts of the country, Jews, like African Americans, came to be denied housing opportunities through restrictive covenants, and they faced many other forms of discrimination. And although Islam per se was still not an object of special suspicion or enmity, the rise of the African American Nation of Islam was met with the harsh repressions that American whites wielded against most forms of African American self-assertion. Much changed with the responses of America and the world to the revelations of Nazi atrocities in World War II. And in light of America's post-war role in trying to be the world's leader toward democracy, freedom, and human rights, against what the U.S. portrayed as totalitarian communism. Early in World War II, in a case arising here in Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court upheld the promotion of citizenship through requiring even school children belonging to dissenting religious groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses to salute the American flag at the start of the school day. But, pressured by civil liberties advocates that included many Jewish leaders, the court soon reversed that ruling, seeing it as licensing denials of free expression and religious bigotry. The nation went on to elect its first Catholic president, the ardent Cold Warrior John F. Kennedy, in 1960. The Supreme Court banned mandatory school prayers, always overwhelmingly Protestant, in 1962 and 1963. Congress ended the national origins quota system in 1965. And though the naturalization oath has continued to require applicants to renounce foreign allegiances, since 1967, the State Department has indicated that, in fact, the U.S. does not object to most forms of dual citizenship, and the Supreme Court has narrowed drastically the actions of dual citizens that constitute renunciations of their American citizenship. Then conservative Protestants and Catholics formed a political alliance against secular liberalism in the 1970s, greatly contributing to the political successes of modern conservatism in America from 1980 on. Partly as a result, today the Supreme Court has 5 Catholic justices, 3 Jews, and 1 Episcopalian who was raised a Catholic. These justices all certainly have their critics, but none are suspected of giving allegiance to anyone other than the United States. In 2000, the Democrats nominated an observant Jew for vice president, and the Democrats' candidates today include the Jewish Bernie Sanders and Michael Bloomberg, as well as the Catholic Joe Biden, the Episcopalian Pete Buttigieg, the Congregationalist Amy Klobuchar, the Methodist Elizabeth Warren, and the Hindu Tulsi Gabbard. None of these religious affiliations is a significant campaign issue. But it's no secret that since the 9/11 attacks, Muslims have come to be regarded with far greater suspicion and hostility, beginning with a special registration initiative aimed at Muslim immigrants during the Bush administration, led by the now prominent nativist Chris Kobach, and continuing through the mildly modified Muslim ban on immigrants from 6 nations that President Trump has imposed. President Trump's inaugural address stated that, quote, "the bedrock of our politics will be a total allegiance to the United States." And he has sharply criticized the kinds of cosmopolitan or global citizenship views that fostered greater acceptance of dual citizenship in preceding decades. He has also questioned the allegiances of Muslim members of Congress. At the same time, he has promised that in his administration, quote, "Christian heritage will be cherished, protected, defended like you've never seen before." His administration is pushing for the Supreme Court to rule that it's not only constitutionally permissible, it's constitutionally mandatory for states to fund religious schools on the same basis as secular public ones in order not to be found guilty of religious discrimination. Christian schools are the chief proponents and will be the chief beneficiaries of any such ruling. And though most conservative Christians now see themselves as great allies of Israel and Jews in order to fulfill what they see as biblical prophecies that do not in fact end so well for Jews, the resurgence of white nationalist movements in the Trump years has included a new wave of anti-Semitic incidents. So issues of dual allegiances, and especially the allegiances and the rights of members of non-Christian religions, including Muslims and Jews, are gaining renewed prominence in the current moment, as they have periodically since the nation's inception. That is why this panel is timely and important, and why I'm looking forward very much to hearing the presentations of my fellow panelists, to which we should now turn.
So from the elegant words of Roger Smith to me, here's what I want to do. I want to dance around the margins that the question of dual allegiances suggests. Some of them are political, some of them are clearly religious, some of them are legal and economic. I'm going to pick a few historical examples to highlight the issues I want to talk about. And I'm going to start by saying, I can't get up here and say, Jews think this, and Jews believe that. Impossible. So I'll focus on a few discrete historical examples and trust that you'll come back with contemporary examples. So just a few blocks down around Independence Mall in the early 19th century, Isaac Leeser, who was the religious leader of Mikveh Israel, the oldest congregation in Philadelphia, declared that with politics, Jews have little concern, except to vote for those whom they individually find most fitting to administer the offices created for the public good. In other words, Jews had no political allegiances qua Jews. They were free agents, no particular affiliations whatsoever. This is a notion that in the 19th century, Jews proclaimed over and over, but it actually belies the very political activities and preferences that Jews had. This was mostly a ideological platform that showed Jews could be loyal. We don't have, as Jews, any political outlook of our own. And I would say if there is one issue on which most Jews agreed and in which most preoccupied them, it was combating the notion of a Christian America. This vision of the U.S. as religiously neutral, although, as many examples Roger just gave us suggest, was always contested, always underneath all the talk about religious neutrality was a notion that it should be a Christian state. But in fact, Jews clung tenaciously to the idea that it would not be so. And they protested it when they could, when they saw examples of it, from major to minor events, when they saw maybe it was going down, the nation was going down that road. One key example in the 19th century, Thanksgiving, holiday of Thanksgiving, was regularly observed in churches, and you had proclamations. Government officials, from the president to governors, issued Thanksgiving proclamations that contained references to Christianity specifically and often calls to worship in churches on Thanksgiving. Year after year, you could pick up the paper on Thanksgiving or the day after, and you'd see the Jewish leaders saying, this is an abandonment of the principles of the Constitution, and it should not be so. Did they ever win this battle? Really? Not really. What happened was Thanksgiving gradually ceased to be a religious holiday and slid more into the secular, and so it kind of went away. But this is hardly a chief political battle, but it is one that recurred regularly, and it was trying to carve out this kind of neutral ground where Jews could feel safe. Other issues, and I'll only talk about this briefly since many of you know about it, some of you in this room better than me, some of the issues weren't ideological, they were legal and economic, such as fighting against Sunday laws, blue laws. And between 1830 and 1890, a series of states, one by one, passed these kinds of laws that barred all sorts of activity, work, leisure, shopping, most often associated with alcohol, but it was all sorts of reasons to keep businesses closed. And of course, those who supported the law regarded Sunday as the real Sabbath, and so things should be closed. Jewish organizations, alongside many other minority groups and civil liberties organizations fought such things. But, in 1961, the Supreme Court upheld the legality of this, saying it didn't infringe on anyone's individual religious liberty. So you will see in states today some remnants of these blue laws. So here in that realm, you do see Christian America often alive and well in its own ways. Second set of issues I want to talk about, and I am thinking about time. When my friend Isaac Leeser said that Jews had no concern with politics, it was to demonstrate that they had no Jewish loyalties that could or would supersede their American allegiances. But Jews had a lot of reason to worry that their allegiances would be questioned because of previous experiences before they came to the United States and because of what they experienced in the United States. It wasn't always for religious reasons. Another 19th century example. In 1862, when Ulysses Grant issued his now infamous General Orders number 11 that expelled Jews from a region, it was his department of Tennessee in the South, covered a few southern states, and he expelled them because they were suspected for being in the illicit trade, cotton speculation, and things that undermine the war effort. Some of them probably were, some non-Jews probably were. War usually has illicit trade. It's kind of a rule of war, or people trading on the side goes together. But the order itself, which is really what I want to focus on, said, and I'm reading from the text of the order, the Jews as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the department within 24 hours from the receipt of this order. The notion expelled as a class brings up fears that frankly go all the way back to Spanish expulsion, that Jews here were not being expelled as religious believers, and that's why I wanted to say something about the elasticity of these notions of allegiance, but as a class. Now, happily, this order was actually pretty quickly revoked, but those kinds of things left many Jews wary about how much they belong. Now, when I say dual loyalty, most people will think automatically about issues of Zionism, which provoked the greatest number of accusations and the greatest fears about dual loyalty. Now, and I should be clear, Jews themselves debated this quite intensely among themselves. There were very, very committed anti-Zionists who said that if we do this, we're going to show that we're a nation, that we're different from other Americans, that we have a dual allegiance somewhere else. And then there were others, best known people like Louis Brandeis, Horace Cowan, who made the case that multiple loyalties were legitimate in America. This vexed the Zionist movement for a very long time, and I think dual loyalty has had, especially with Palestine and later Israel, a very long life. Sometimes in ironic ways, like recently Trump calling Democratic Jews disloyal if they didn't support Israel. You know, you can turn this in knots if you try hard enough. Before I run out of time, I just want to say briefly something about party loyalties and allegiances. What Isaac Leeser in the 19th century did not predict was the ways that politics became, for many American Jews, the very heart of their identity, sometimes even much more than their religious identities. And for, today we throw around the term secular Jew to mean a Jew who doesn't believe in anything. But certainly in the early 20th century, secular Jewishness was the very essence of Jewish identity for many. And here I mean mostly committed Jews on the left, socialists, communists, anarchists, all the isms that many Jews flocked to, both in Europe and still when they came to the United States in the early 20th century. This also opened them to many charges of dual allegiance in the Red Scare, in the McCarthy era, and many, many other times, too long to list. Even when Jews embraced the Democratic Party, which didn't happen until FDR in the 30s, when labor and the left came together to support FDR, their allegiance was suspect and actually cast some aspersions on FDR. The anti-Semitic press was full of the New Deal being called the Jew Deal, and much of that remains very much with us, I think. And I'm just going to say one last thing, and it's because you brought up Joe Lieberman's campaign for the vice presidency, and it gets me back to talking about Christian America. When Joe Lieberman ran, he was very open about talking about his faith as a Jew. And everyone recognized at the time how unusual it was for a Jewish individual to be, this on the top of, vice president or presidential candidate. It had never happened. So he spoke quite openly, and he's an Orthodox Jew. And this caused great backlash in the American Jewish community. The Anti-Defamation League, a very conservative organization, said, please don't do that. We don't like it when everybody else brings their religion into the public square, so take all your religion and get it out of the public square. There have been exceptions to that idea. Chabad, Lubavitch, Hasidim, now really want to put the large menorah in the park next to the large Christmas tree, which I guess could be multiple loyalties, but I would say most Jews really do react to having public displays of religion in any kind of public setting and in the party arena. And part of that is the fear of Christian America, which does linger. So I will say, sadly, that notion is maybe with us again, the desire to have a Christian America, having a return engagement. But on a more hopeful note, so are the forces that fight vigorously against that vision of the United States. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thanks very much to the Collegium Institute and to Peg and my fellow panelists for returning here. The problem of dual allegiances often arises when religious minorities live in a state at odds with their religion, as when Jews and Muslims lived in medieval Christendom. Yet the problem of dual allegiances has also occurred within the same religion. And I have in mind here among Christians in early America. Many early American Catholics, as Rogers noted, distrusted the political allegiances of Catholics. In most American colonies, Catholics were prohibited from holding public office, worshiping in public, sending their children to Catholic schools, and many other injunctions. Catholicism was considered a great threat to American society on this view because Catholics pledged their ultimate allegiance to the Pope in Rome. Boston revolutionary Samuel Adams explained that papists, in his words, bring subversion of government by introducing that solecism in politics, imperium in imperio, that is, a state within a state, leading directly, he continued, to the worst anarchy and confusion, civil discord, bloodshed, and war. What made Catholicism so odious were two claims about papal authority. First, that the Pope held authority over all civil rulers, including the right even to depose them. And second, that the Pope claimed an infallible teaching authority in faith and morals. These two beliefs were considered fatal to civil allegiance of Catholics. If Catholics believed that the Pope could depose a civil ruler or authorize resistance against civil laws, then Catholics were traitors in waiting. As John Locke argued, no such person should be tolerated. Now, to answer these charges, and they were across the board in early America, American Catholics during this time developed three strategies. The first was to try to avoid the controversy altogether, to sidestep the whole problem of dual loyalties. The second was to deny the two beliefs about papal authority, so Catholics denying that the Pope had these powers. And the third was to emphasize their public service, military service, public office, and so on, to their country. So let's look at the first strategy that early American Catholics employed. In the 17th century, English monarchs required their subjects to swear the oath of allegiance, starting in 1606 and continuing throughout the centuries. This oath demanded that subjects bear allegiance to the king. So far, no problem. But it also required subjects to swear that they rejected the beliefs that the Pope could depose the king, absolve oaths to the king, to incite rebellion against the king, and so on. Anyone sailing to the English colonies at this time had to take this oath of allegiance before they boarded the ship to America. For the vast majority of these settlers, this posed no problem. But to the Catholics who wanted to get to America, this presented a challenge. For the Pope decreed that anyone who swore this oath of allegiance would be automatically excommunicated from the church. And so Catholics during this time were presented with irreconcilable options of heresy or treason. Finding a solution to this oath of allegiance problem was all the more urgent for the founder of Maryland, Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore. Calvert was a Catholic convert who desired Catholic settlers to join his colony. So Calvert revised the oath of allegiance. Found in the archives that he erased all the controversial clauses about the oath of allegiance. They just disappear with his pen. All it required was a simple pledge of fidelity to the king and his successors. It avoided altogether the problem of papal authority. Now, of course, with this erasing of certain clauses, he did not resolve the problems of dual loyalties altogether. But he did create a space for Catholics and Protestants to live together in relative freedom. He was also the one who created the first Anglophone Toleration Act in the history of England in America. The second strategy that Catholics used was to deny papal powers that made Catholics so suspect. This strategy was used, perhaps surprisingly, by the first Catholic bishop in the United States, John Carroll. Bishop Carroll believed that the Pope was the center of ecclesiastical unity, but he did not have the power to teach infallibly on faith and morals by himself. According to this tradition that Carroll was tapping into, only the teachings of a general council, all the bishops together, could teach infallibly on faith and morals. Furthermore, Bishop Carroll believed that the only authority a pope has was, in his words, purely spiritual. And this authority could not in any way conflict with the loyalties or obligations demanded of citizenship in the United States. He even demanded that the first bishop, it turned out to be him, would be elected by his fellow clergymen, not appointed by the Pope himself, so as to avoid any fear that the Pope was intervening in American affairs. Yet, Protestants might remain suspicious of Catholics who denied papal authority as Bishop Carroll did. After all, Locke had called such Catholics false and fallacious for thinking that they could separate it so cleanly between the Pope's spiritual and temporal powers. So Catholics also attempted to show their loyalty through public service to their country. Charles Carroll of Carrollton is a good example of this third strategy. Like his cousin, Bishop Carroll, Charles Carroll denied these two claims about papal authority, But he also went on to show his loyalty to the American Republic as a member of the Continental Congress, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, an emissary seeking Canadian support for the revolutionary cause, and a senator in the first federal Congress. And so when one congressman in 1795 began to, according to the record, ridicule certain tenets in the Roman Catholic religion during Congress's one of many immigration debates, James Madison rose to the floor and replied that Americans had no right to ridicule Catholics. They had proved good citizens during the Revolution. And James Madison's personal friendship with Bishop Carroll and his cousin Charles, as well as the sacrifices of Catholics in the Revolutionary War, the Marquis de Lafayette and so on, seemed to impress upon him the compatibility of Catholics with the new American Republic. And yet, for Catholics, the specter of the Pope continued to fuel anti-Catholicism throughout the centuries. As Rogers mentioned, from the 19th century riots in this city to the questions about John F. Kennedy's fitness for the presidency as a Catholic. So while these three strategies proved relatively successful in early America, Catholicism continued to grow, new dioceses were erected. The fact that Catholics had to use these strategies indicates that America is a jealous sovereign, requiring, as our nationalization of states, the renunciation of all allegiance to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty. That oath is the same as it is today, as it was in the beginning in the Republic. And although dual allegiances might be understood more capaciously today, the specter of papal authority and the questions that Catholics have about their leader continues today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael.
All right. I am mindful of time and hopeful for us to have a bit of a discussion. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks within the minimum allotted time we have, although you always say that and then you ramble. But okay. So I want to start off, it's interesting having this discussion about dual allegiances. I was at the Sixers game last night, and this question arose for me because I am a lifelong Lakers fan who has lived in Philadelphia now for upwards of a decade and has grown to love Philadelphia sports. And as I sat there, when you're in the Sixers stadium, it doesn't really, you can be a Sixers fan unless they're playing the Lakers, and I never go watch those games. You don't really have a question. The problem was, at a certain point, I realized the team we were playing were the Los Angeles Clippers. And the teleprompter thing up there was encouraging fans to chant, "Beat LA, beat LA." And I turned to my friend and I said, this is too difficult for me. I cannot make that chant. Right? The Los Angeles Lakers, it cuts at my other allegiance. So I wanted to be sure to bring that up because I felt it was quite ironic that happened. As I was asked to do this talk, a number of things came into my mind. Immediately, as a Muslim, when you think about this question of dual allegiances, dual loyalties, 9/11 is this specter that exists. And as someone who, I worked in the US Senate on 9/11. I worked for Senator Max Cleland before 9/11, through 9/11, and afterwards. And these questions were very present, very raw in those initial days. I would argue that they actually have been even sort of more explicit and I would say rawer, if you will, in more recent times. But it was always interesting to me, though, because prior to 9/11, I had spent time with my senator, and he was if you know Senator Cleland, he's a triple amputee, so once a week we would rotate responsibilities with him, and one of those responsibilities, you were with him, you were his right-hand person, you took him to the Senate floor, you took him everywhere he went. And one of the places we always went was to Bible study. and that was with the Senate chaplain. And that was in the room right across from the Senate floor. And you would go and he'd do his vote, and then we'd go to Bible study. And there was no issue for me at that stage. I did think it was always interesting, right, that I'm like in the Senate and we're signing things off the year of our Lord, and then I'm taking the senator to Bible study across the hallway. And then we're having these discussions about how, we are a fiercely kind of secular country. And 9/11 happens, and now the sort of other discussion about Muslims as a fifth element comes in that way. So I start then with the question about allegiance and what exactly that means. And it's a difficult word because dual allegiance sort of automatically assumes there's a conflict between these two allegiances. And I thought, is there another word that might be better? Like W.E.B. Du Bois talks about the two-ness that he felt as an American and as someone of African descent, this double consciousness. So is that kind of what we're speaking about? And for Muslim Americans, I think part of the challenge is it's not just dual. It's not just a dual allegiance or consciousness that you have. There's at least three. Right? There's at least three. There is your identity, your allegiance to you as a Muslim, as your religion. There's your allegiance or identity as an American. And then there is this identity that you have to whatever your racial or ethnic grouping is. Right? Those three are at least the ones that are operating, let alone the fact that we all sort of deal with many other allegiances. But I want to structure some of my remarks around that. So for Muslims, I would say that part of the challenge as you think about these identities is also sort of how they are viewing the world through the realm of their allegiance to what is moral, their allegiance to a community, and then their allegiance to some type of identity. From the moral standpoint, part of the question that comes up is, through what do you filter your understanding of the moral? And this is an interesting question as it relates to American allegiance as well, because I recall being in Morocco almost 2 decades ago with cadets from VMI, the Virginia Military Institute. They had an Arabic language program there, VMI did. I wasn't at VMI, but I participated in it. And I remember at a certain point, one of the individuals, he had been in the Army, and he was telling us about a situation where in Bosnia or some location, there had been a young boy who was coming towards him with some apples, or a cart of apples, but he didn't know if they were grenades. And his orders were he had to shoot. And we were talking about another situation where he's hiding out, scoping out sort of enemy territory, and what happens if he makes eye contact with some child who's playing there, who now notices that he's there? What do you do? And his response was, well, I have to take them out because they now jeopardize my sort of other fellow soldiers, the mission, etc. And I started posing questions to him. I said, well, okay, what if you know that that is wrong, morally wrong? What are you going to do then? No, it simply cannot be. And I realized for him, American interest, what was in the interest of America, what was in the interest of his particular unit, was what was morally right. That was the analysis for him. Even to the point, the only point, and I kept pushing him, to the point where I said, all right, well, what if God comes down and tells you, do not shoot? What are you going to do in that situation? And he refused to accept the question because there is no way that God would say what was against American interests. Right? So this question of what filter do you see it through? And I think for Muslims, part of that challenge that comes up is what moral value is supreme? And what's the primary motivating question? I think in American society and for our American allegiance, what the primary moral value that is supreme is this notion of freedom, right? Or some idea of it. And that then is laid next to the other question for the Muslim is obedience to God. And generally they're fine, they're sort of operating together, but what happens when there is conflict between those? What happens when the motivating question of what God wants from you conflicts with sort of the operating or motivating question within your American society? So that's kind of the moral, how are you filtering this moral question? The other issue comes up is that as a Muslim, you're also part of a larger collective. You're part of a Muslim community, not just the one in the US, but part of a global community of people who share that same belief and commitment. What does allegiance to America mean when America is perpetually in conflict with that global community, right? So as Americans, as a nation, we've been engaged in sort of warfare, or at least bombings of Muslim nations for many decades now, right? What does that mean? What does that do to sort of where your allegiances lie? Then how does that play out with the moral that you have? And I say that because it's also interesting. There's mention about, I think Rogers had talked about Muslims in the American space. There's an interesting thing is that Muslims were actually banned from the Americas in the 16th century. And the reason they were banned is in 1522, about 20 slaves, Muslim slaves in Hispaniola, revolted. And subsequent to that, there was a sense that Muslim slaves were problematic because they would revolt. And there was a sense that if you're going to get slaves over here, try to avoid having them be Muslim. And my suspicion, although there's not much that's written about it, is part of that motivation for revolt came from a religious obligation to actually seek freedom, because that's the status that God originally gave you. Sort of ironic, given kind of our primary supreme moral value being freedom today. Okay, so the last thing I want to say on this is how is this conflict dealt with today in America? And I would say there are multiple ways. And I would argue that it's not just in American society, but I think Muslims, even in Muslim societies, deal with how you sort of handle a situation where your own moral sort of and religious obligation, your religious sort of posture is in conflict with the state. There's a quietist approach, which has been, if you're allowed to practice your faith, then everything else is okay. Fine, there are issues, etc. But as long as you're allowed to practice your faith, it's fine. That's why the anti-Sharia legislation that started up in a lot of states was very unnerving to even all these folks who had been like, listen, let's just not rock the boat. We're allowed to pray. We're allowed to have our mosques. Just let's not worry about it. That became very disconcerting. The other response is actually, I would say, a very uniquely American one, which is dissent. That in fact, you have to agitate for change. You have to demand greater moral accountability from the United States on social justice issues, on issues that impact the global community, that you have to take advantage of your privileges here in order to agitate at the grassroots level, and that is your obligation. And here, I think, is where sort of the community moves between these places, right? Where they're trying to figure out where in the civic space, those ideals that end up conflicting, whether with their religious morality or with sort of their allegiance to this global community, how to handle that constructively, or in a more quietist way, or destructively, which I would say is the route that some young men take towards terrorism. And that's where I'll end.
Thank you.